here on out. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we covered at Next. So I think this session should serve a couple purposes. One is hopefully in 30 minutes you're going to hear about nearly 30 sessions. So I hope this is a great use of time for you. If you look at all of the different AI sessions at Next, it's a ton of content. But this will give you a way to kind of at a broad brush see all the things that were talked about. And you might hear about a couple things that you say, you know, that's really interesting. I think I'm going to dive deeper into that. And you can sort of bookmark what you might want to visit later. So we just wrapped up all 9 weeks of Next, and the content is still there. At the end of the presentation, I have a link so that you can find it. If you don't Google it, I'll provide that at the end. So let's dive in. So there were essentially 3 themes in AI Week for Next. So the first is tools for everyone on your team. And that really means that we're going to cover some of the capabilities for building models, deploying models, et cetera, at different skill levels, right? And different folks involved in the process, whether you're a data scientist or maybe a developer that's integrating ML into your application, talking about things from a tools perspective. So this is going to be the more technical section of this discussion. The second piece is around how Google Cloud AI supports improved customer experience. And so one of the things you're going to see today, if you're not familiar with it, is how Google Cloud AI has expanded our focus to include solutions where we're taking repeatable AI use cases and packaging them up so that you don't necessarily have to be an AI expert, and you can integrate, you know, whether it's a contact center AI solution or providing product recommendations, document AI. These are a number of different things where you can now work at that higher level of solving the problem, but you also have the platform and the individual tools and components if you want to build it yourself. So the second theme here focuses on how our products, either the building blocks or the solutions, provide an improved customer experience. The final thing we'll talk about is around just real-world use cases. How does AI help in different industries and provide value? We'll also have some case studies. Some of these are more about using the product. Others are technical around how did they build a team to solve AI problems. What kind of project management framework did they use? Who were the team members? What tools did they use? So some really a nice blend of case studies are at Next. So those are the 3 themes. So let's dive on into the first one, tools for everyone on your team. And let's start with responsible AI. So this is from our AI strategy director, Tracy Frey, who well, and by the way, I'm going to show one slide from each of these different presentations, right? So, of course, one slide doesn't say it all, but I tried to pick a representative slide. I'll try to touch on the high points of each of the different sessions, and you know, we'll just go from there. So, AI 105, responsible AI. You see here, there's basically 3 pieces of this: principles and practices. And we go through specific guidance from Google, as well as some interesting stories in our journey in terms of responsible AI, which really we believe should underpin everything you're doing here with AI, that you're starting with the end in mind, with the principles. Now, principles on paper without any governance are not really very helpful, and that's where programs come in. And every organization is looking at, how do I govern my use of AI, monitor it, and make sure that I'm you know, managing risk, et cetera. And finally, another section is around tools. So how do I do that? What are some of the tools available? And they get into some you know, specific things like the what if tool that allows you to understand how your model is making predictions, or something called model cards, which allow you to describe your model. You know, you can put performance metrics in this model card that has other metadata as well, like things like how should the model be used, what are limitations of the model, all of that. So overall, this session provides a nice overview of the principal programming tools for responsible AI. Let's talk now about another kind of process-oriented session that I think is helpful if you're looking at your organization and your journey towards AI. How do you know where you're at, and how do you strategically think about all the different pieces of AI and how to do it sort of the right way? And what this does is kind of break it up into different pillars of AI maturity. So the first one is about learning, right? We all know that AI, ML has so much to learn. You can spend years focusing on a very small, very deep subset of AI, or you can go very broad and connect all the dots together into a solution. And the learning talks about, hiring, as well as how do you continue to train and provide more opportunities for your team, in partnering where there are other companies you can work with to work together to provide a more complete solution for your users. The next section is around leadership. It talks about best practices around having that executive sponsor for an AI project. As we all, who have done these projects know that AI, it can't be done in a silo. You need buy-in from groups that manage the data, and those can be in different parts of the business, and getting those different data sources together, understanding once you build the model, how is it going to be used? How do we roll this into a production system? How do we manage it? As well as things like building your AI model and deploying it in a real-world project. You might have different project management practices than a typical software development project, right? Because there's a lot of research and discovery, and things don't always fit into nice 2-week sprints, right? Where you know everything up front. So how do you manage that sort of uncertainty when you're running AI projects? The next aspect that's talked about is access, right? So having access to all the data that makes sense to build that model in your organization, and versioning it, is key, right? As you're building models, making sure that you have a broad set of features that are relevant is key to getting the accuracy you need. And also, you want to think about, how do I make my model discoverable, shared across my organization so other folks can use it? Not even to mention things like feature stores, where you might even take features of your model and share them across different parts of your business, so that you can sort of build models on top of those building blocks. From a security perspective, it's key to think about only allowing access to the key parts of the data that are needed to solve the problem. So this gets into data protection, identity management, really key concepts for secure AI solutions. From a scale perspective, the talk kind of covers all the different scalable services. So thinking about, how do you, say, have a huge distributed training job and scale that out and back? How do you take advantage of accelerators, GPUs, TPUs, et cetera, to get the results from your training faster? And finally, automation. So you can do a lot of these things manually, but often they're going to fall apart if you don't have a reproducible process. So thinking about things like, how do I create a pipeline where I check the accuracy of my model, or I deploy it automatically, or maybe I have model retraining as new data comes in. How am I taking advantage of that, building new models off of that, et cetera? How am I testing my model and the data coming in and inside my model, making sure that the inputs are correct? So all those different things are critical. There is another session in MLOps where we're going to cover this in more detail, but this session basically covers sort of the framework for AI adoption. This next session is from our Director of Product Management, Craig Wiley. and it's really a broad overview of the AI platform. And so it covers the end-to-end capabilities, not only what's currently available, but you see a couple new capabilities that we'll be rolling out over the next bit here, where I mentioned a feature store where you'll be able to share features of models, continuous monitoring, where you can watch for the accuracy of a model. As we know that sometimes over time, the conditions under which you built your model might change, and you'll see this drift where your accuracy starts to go down. And so continuous monitoring can help you stay on top of that. And finally, there'll be more focus on pipelines. And so you may have seen some of the product announcements around cloud AI pipelines, which allows you to host Kubeflow pipelines in a GKE cluster. This takes it to the next level with the full serverless offering. So you're not managing any infrastructure. You're building pipelines that can use Kubeflow in TensorFlow extended components, and using a metadata store. So as you complete different steps in your pipeline, you're able to store artifacts and track accuracy and what data set you used, et cetera, in that pipeline. There's another session, Intro to MLOps on Google Cloud, that gets into more detail on some of the workflows for ensuring that your ML models are deployed to production reliably. And so you kind of see here in this diagram that layer of MLOps where you have pipelines kind of connecting all the dots. You've got data science, the data science layer where you're building notebooks and then eventually deploying those models. And at the bottom you have your production system. So you're going to be integrating with various data stores. And finally, your model might be integrated into a production application, using the SDKs or maybe a REST API to use predictions from your model. So one of the big announcements that we had late last year was around TensorFlow Enterprise. And TensorFlow Enterprise brings a lot of benefits of the open source TensorFlow framework for building models and great support on Google Cloud. And this talk covers the 3 pillars of the TensorFlow Enterprise strategy. The first is around cloud scale performance, where it will talk about some of the connectors for BigQuery and Google Cloud Storage, and how basically the build of TensorFlow Enterprise enables increased performance with no additional work on users' part. So basically it's transparent when deployed on Google Cloud. The TensorFlow Enterprise builds are specially optimized for Google Cloud. The second piece around managed services talks about all the different ways in which TensorFlow Enterprise is available on Google Cloud. For instance, in our virtual machine images, having the TensorFlow Enterprise builds on there, or the AI platform training services where you can select a TensorFlow Enterprise build, et cetera, basically showing you how do you take advantage of that performance. And finally, a discussion around support, right, where Google understands that enterprises, are careful about wanting to avoid this treadmill of constantly upgrading things, right? And so with TensorFlow Enterprise, we are, marking certain versions as long-term support versions, and patches and important bug fixes will continue to be backported to those versions so that you can stay on that version for an extended period of time. And the next session is about PyTorch and TPUs. So we'll kind of cover a couple of things. One is that this session kind of reinforces the fact that we have many PyTorch users, a very popular framework. So we support, of course, not only TensorFlow, but PyTorch, sklearn, XGBoost, et cetera. And specifically with PyTorch here, we talk about how you can, with some minor code changes, which are in this technical talk. There's actually walking through how do you train on TPUs. It gets into all of that. Talks about the XLA, or the extended linear algebra library for Torch. So basically importing a slightly different package than the standard Torch package that will compile, so the instructions will run on the TPU. It takes care of that for you. The session will talk through how all that works. And we're next going to talk about is the AI infrastructure session in general. So if you want a broad brush view of the different ways you can take advantage of AI infrastructure on the Google Cloud, this session is a good one for that. So it'll talk about the AI platform managed services. It'll talk about GKE, or the Google Kubernetes engine, that allows you to build containerized application and that also can take advantage of GPU or TPU, as well as the compute engine, right, where you have virtual machines that can use these accelerators as well. So there's another session on TPUs and Kaggle. So this session is about the journey that Kaggle made to TPUs. And if you've used Kaggle before, you might be familiar with how you can pick a GPU. Historically, you're able to do that to run certain competition. Then you get your models trained with that. Now we made an additional option of allowing TPUs to be directly accessible with the notebooks. And so there's no provisioning, and using TensorFlow 2.x, starting with 2.1 and now even more so with 2.3, using TPUs is really straightforward. And so this session talks about a flower classification competition and how TPUs were used in that, and how basically it was really well adopted by the community, really robust message boards where folks are asking a lot of questions and contributing and building solutions with TPUs. So this is a nice case study around using them, and talks about how you can experiment with TPUs pretty easily on Kaggle. Okay, so speaking of TPUs, this session is, or sorry, speaking of Kaggle, this next session is talking about AI notebooks on Google Cloud. And there's really a lot that's covered. I just happened to pick one slide around something new here, which is Kaggle integration, where what you're seeing in this little animation here is if you're in Kaggle, you can, and the notebook, or what they call a kernel interface, you can upgrade that notebook and pull it directly into an AI platform notebooks instance. So it's a nice way to, as you're building something in Kaggle, to pull that into Google Cloud if you want to take advantage of more cloud services and pull it into a Google Cloud project. And this session talks about some of the other updates and sort of state of the union around cloud AI platform notebooks. The next session here is around interpreting ML models with explainable AI. And it covers all the different ways that you can use our explainable AI capability to understand what's happening in a TensorFlow model. So it will provide you attributions of which features had the most impact. And you can see where it started here in several different parts of the platform, and more being added as we go. If you're using AutoML tables for tabular data, and you build a model, you can get the explainability reports from that. If you're using our managed services for the AI platform training prediction, that's there as well. When you make an API call, you can pull back the explanations. And the SDK for AI explainability is now built into our VM images. So if you just use one of those VM images, use AI platform notebooks, you can use the SDK to use the explainable AI capability. And this session gets into a lot of detail around the various methods that are being used for that, and how to invoke the APIs and how to understand the results. And by the way, Sarah did a session on that today, so hopefully that that helps with explainable AI. All right, good. So we're ready to go to our next session around improved customer experience. So this next session is around the challenging times that we're in and how Google Cloud AI has helped during these times. So it kind of talks about some case studies around how contact center AI, which we'll get into a little more later, which helps provide chatbots and conversational AI capability for contact centers, has helped handle caseloads better. Something called PPP, which is a government loan program that's helped small businesses during this time take advantage of lending AI, which is another thing we're going to talk about in the financial services section today. But basically a specialization of our document AI capability that allows you to go through loan applications very efficiently. And finally, even in Google Meet, there's been additional AI technology built into that for things like noise cancellation to continue improving that product. Okay, so contact center AI. You may already be familiar with it. If not, this is the sort of state of the union on this product. And it covers sort of, here's a few of the existing capabilities. Dialogflow, which is kind of the foundation that allows you for building chat and voice interactions. Agent Assist, which is for human agents and giving them tips, FAQs, helping the conversation along so it's more productive as they're working with clients. And then CCAI Insights for metrics around the call center. A new announcement in this session is Dialogflow CX, which is a visual flow builder UI to build these conversational AI applications. So this is a big new announcement. CX is customer experience, and you'll find out more in that CCI session. All right, so let's talk about another AI solution called Document AI. So if you've worked with documents before, you might be familiar with how some of our natural language and vision APIs can work great with documents. So we've got OCR capabilities, we've got things like entity extraction, sentiment analysis, etc. But now we're building more and more capabilities that really hone in on specific types of documents. So you've got your general services that work on any document. You also have custom document capabilities with AutoML that allow you to provide your own documents and train on those. So for your specific use cases, you can use AutoML. And now we have specialized document AI models that are pre-built models for various types of documents. So this session will get into more detail around how to use document AI. So another way to engage with customers in our global economy is translation, right? So maybe you have a product or a service that is accessible, in one or several languages, and you want to extend the reach of it. So the translation API can be great for that. This session talks about a few things, right? So it talks about our translation capabilities, how we've got the standard APIs that can, translate over 100 languages, have language detection, extremely accurate. It talks about the advanced version of that, where you can provide glossaries if you have more specific terminology that you want to include in it. And then a new product announcement that you see here is the media translation API. And this is really a real-time API that's combining translation and speech to text. And you might say, well, okay, that doesn't sound like that big of a deal, but it's technically complex, right? Because you have timing issues, you have multiple APIs needing to work together. This will literally take a real-time feed from a microphone or audio file, connect it to the translation API, and give you translated content out of that. So that's a new announcement from that session. Speaking of speech to text, There's another session that's, you notice here the different numbering. So this is 300, or one of our more expert sessions. And this is around how do you measure speech-to-text accuracy and improve it. And one of the lessons out of this session is that you don't have to train a new model to improve on our existing APIs. So maybe you use our APIs and they're working great, but they get kind of hung up on a word or two, or maybe they're not quite recognizing the way that they should. And that's great. There are some word hints, basically some boosts you can provide to the APIs if you've got kind of some specialized terminology or certain words that you want to kind of tweak the probabilities of. So this session talks about how do you measure it, something called this word error rate, or WER, and then it talks about how do you improve it based on, and again, without doing anything to train a model yourself. Okay. So kind of rounding out the whole customer experience piece, there's a session around personalization on Google Cloud. And this slide talks about recommendations AI, which is a big part of our personalization story. And recommendations AI is a solution where you can take various data sources from your organization and then run it through this process where you can select what's the recommendation type, what are you optimizing for, and then applying some filters and custom rules, etc. And finally making those recommendations available maybe in your web e-commerce application, on mobile channels, and sort of it really covers how a recommendation AI solution provides great recommendations and how it can be used. So that's the customer experience piece. Now let's move on to deployed AI. So this is about applying AI into different industries and different enterprise use cases. Okay, so you just heard about recommendations AI, and that's part of the overall retail story. So there's a lot of great, interesting retail capability. This slide just shows one example of that, like vision product search, like searching for a product with an image and then getting back a list of similar items with that, or recommendations AI, or even a search capability where getting Google quality text and vision search capabilities embedded into the retail site. Healthcare is another area where we are creating more specific, deeper capabilities here. So we have two things I want to talk about: the API and AutoML. So in healthcare, you might see sure, it's documents, it's text, but there's some differences in that there's very specialized terminology. Often some of the notes are very terse with a lot of abbreviations. You might see Latin words in it. There's a lot of specialization in this field. So healthcare natural language API uses the same concepts as our natural language API, but is tuned for healthcare domain problems. Likewise, there's the AutoML entity extraction for healthcare, where you can take things like doctor's notes, claims, medical literature, etc., and build models that are tuned for healthcare. Let's move on to industrial use cases. This is just one of the examples in this manufacturing example, but it talks about a Google data center. And it talks about how this idea of you can have sensors, for instance, that are looking at the temperature throughout the building. You have neural networks predicting future temperature changes, and then you're adjusting as needed. And we've applied this technology in our data centers and seen drastically reduced energy consumption by using some of these techniques, right? So these are called industrial adaptive controls, sort of this control loop that uses AI. There's another deep dive on another session here called that's visual inspection AI. So this is also in industrial manufacturing, where it talks about a solution that helps to inspect the quality of different products that are being produced. And here's one, specific case study that we're seeing here, where it's, inspecting, some circuit boards, and it talks about some case studies where the false positives and false negatives have been dramatically reduced using the visual inspection solution. Okay. So for financial services, there is quite a bit to cover in that presentation, if that happens to be the field you're in. One of the new announcements is the Lending Doc AI that's in alpha. And we talked about document AI, and we're going to dive even deeper into lending documents, because this is just a repeatable problem that can be dramatically improved with AI. If you've ever applied for a mortgage or done a refinance, and you know all the paperwork that's required, the length of the process, and this can help with processing those documents, taking unstructured data, converting that to structured data, helping more quickly onboard and reduce errors and costs. Okay, so case study. So we've covered a lot of the new product announcements. Let's kind of move on to how some customers have used Google Cloud AI. Okay, so the first case study comes from Accenture, where they talk about how they've used Google Cloud AI for a broad spectrum of life sciences use case. So thinking about things like research or drug discovery, clinical trials management, or helping support patients. All of these different use cases. They talk about their platform and how they're using Google Cloud to manage each section of that. There's going to be two different financial services use cases I'll talk about. This first one is around signal generation. So this comes from a financial services customer who was using structured data, and it was sparse data. They were getting some signal to make predictions, but they wanted to use some unstructured data to improve their models. And so they talked about how they were using natural language capability to improve on their models, and kind of product by product, how they used each of those for the full, ETL and model training process, and kind of how they use different AI techniques for building their solution. The next financial services use case is around treasury clearance fails. So this is kind of a maybe obscure topic, but it's when there's treasury securities, there's about 1 to 2% fail every day. So that basically means that in the market for these securities, the buyer and the seller aren't matched, and that can cause issues in the financial services market. So the bank that's responsible for this was looking at how do we improve that with AI. So they're able to do some forecasting to say, maybe a couple hours before the market closed, what's the likelihood of that happening, and is there anything we can do to mitigate that? So this session talks about how they did some prediction, and you can see kind of as we walk through each swim lane here, they talk about how did they build the team of cross-functional folks with cloud skills, data scientists, et cetera, and what tools they were using for that. So they talk about how did they gather the data into the data warehouse, how do they prepare the data? As many of us know from building models, you can't just sort of take the raw data. There's a lot of work to adapt it, transform it into a way that it can be used in the models. So they talk about the data engineering and how that was critical. Then the model training piece and building the models on the cloud. And finally, once the models are built, how do they build a on-prem prediction service? How did they integrate that into a Java application? So really a case study that talks about building a cross-functional team to solve an AI problem. Okay, so the next one here is around, you heard about the contact center AI solution. So this was about deploying conversational AI during this pandemic, and a client that basically had a lot of spikes in inquiries and calls, and by using this technology, they were able to handle a much larger caseload. And so this kind of talks about their challenges and how this helped quite a bit. Okay, so that was a lot of information, but I want to leave you with this URL here, cloudwithgoogle.com/next, where you'll find these different AI sessions. AI week is week 8, and thank you very much. I know I may have run a couple minutes over, but I may be able to take questions.
That was right on time. Thank you, Karl. So informative. Sure. I loved your last share, because that was one of the questions. Where the recording or resources for AI week? And I can certainly also quickly share the sessions here. One moment, in the chat. We have another question. When can we expect the managed Kubeflow pipelines?
I don't have a date on that. That's something that this slide was more of a, here's our vision, here's where we're going with the platform, but expect it soon. We're working on that. It's, I believe, in alpha right now. So yeah, managed pipelines is Kubeflow pipelines provided as a managed service, so no infrastructure, and we're working on making that available soon, but I can't give you a date.
Great, thank you. Any other questions? Last chance.
And I'll be on Slack too if you have any follow-up questions.
Oh, fantastic. Yes, feel free. Of course, a lot of information. Thank you, Karl, and feel free to add more questions for Karl. Everybody always asks about the slides. Will you share the slides, Karl?
Yeah, I've given them to Bill as a PDF.
Oh, fantastic, fantastic.
Yeah, thank you. And yes, and I got the comment. Yeah, work closely with Robert Crow, right? So the managed pipelines is using TFX, right? So we're kind of bringing together Kubeflow pipelines and TFX capabilities. It's a longer topic. We can maybe do another DevFest presentation on that. You can find me on Slack if you have more questions. Thanks. All right.